Hi, this is Mia Wood, Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Philosophy and Sociology Department at Pierce College. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Boole program, one of the programs used in connection with language, proof, and logic, the logic textbook by John Barwise and John Etchemendy. There's a whole lot to do with Boole, but like I said, we're just going to cover the basics so that you have a sense of what the program does and how you can complete exercises using it. So let's get started. First thing that we will look at is the side-by-side pane, or side-by-side panes rather, the reference column on the left and the sentence window on the right. We will also look at using the buttons, which after having looked at the Tarski's World program should be familiar to you. We will also look at the assessment tools for evaluating sentences individually, as well as comparing sentences and determining whether or not one sentence is truth functionally a consequence of another or others. In addition, we will talk a little bit about creating files in Boole. You should know that there are no existing files. In other words, no files come with the Boole program. That means that we will create our own files and save them according to the instructions in a given exercise. So let's get started. As with the other programs we've discussed, that is Submit, Tarski's World, and Fitch, Boole is in the Language, Proof, and Logic folder that is installed in your Applications folder. You can also drag it onto your dock if you are a Mac user. Okay, so what will open up when the program launches is a single window. There are two panes, the left side and the right side. Notice that your cursor will automatically appear on the left side. This is your reference column side of the window. And on the other side is where individual sentences will be typed. So let's focus for the moment on atomic sentences represented by capital letters P, Q, and R. When you want to start building your reference columns, you will use your keyboard to type in a capital letter. So let's start with P. And notice how the black one in a pair of parentheses turns green. And that is meant to tell you that there is one atomic sentence that has been satisfactorily written. If you were for example, instead of typing a capital P, you typed a lowercase p, you'd get a 1 in red, and that is an alert to let you know that you have not used the correct notation. So suppose that you have two atomic sentences in your compound sentence. Suppose you have P and Q. There are two ways that you can add another reference column. You can either go to the drop-down menu and add a column after. You could also add a column before, and adding a column after or a column before the column that is currently in place is a matter of adding a column to the left or to the right of the existing sentence. So let's add a column after. Remember, we can do this by the drop-down menu. We can also use Control or Apple A. When you add the column after, notice there's a vertical line that appears. As the table is filled in, that line will get longer. Now you have a number 2 that's meant to designate the second atomic sentence, and we'll call the sentence Q. Once it has been typed in correctly, that is using the proper notation, you get a green arrow. There are a couple of ways that you can fill your reference columns. One is simply to go to the drop-down menu and type in Fill Reference Columns. If you do that, you will have two columns, 4 rows each of the standard generation of truth values. That is, on the far left, TTFF, half true, half false, and on the far right, alternating true, false, true, false. Another way that you can build your reference columns is to actually manually type them in. So you just click under your atomic sentence and you'll see the turquoise area highlighted. Tap the letter T on your keyboard. It'll automatically come up as a capital T. And then continue down until you are done. Remember, half true, half false on the left, alternating true, false on the right. Moving on to your sentence pane, here again, notice you have a 1. This is in reference to the number of sentences that you have. So suppose that you just have one compound sentence. It could be something like the following: negation, parentheses, P, conjunction, Q, close parentheses. Notice that the moment you type a well-formed formula, the number 1, in this case, turns green. If it's not well-formed, so suppose that you're missing a closed parenthesis, you'll get a red number 1. Notice once you have constructed the sentence, you need to determine the sentence's truth value. Notice that the column under the main connective is highlighted, and that's a good way to help you learn how to build out to your main connective. So on the assumption that we know our truth definitions for conjunction, we can fill them in. The moment you click under the column under the connective for which you are going to calculate your truth values, your reference rows will be highlighted. Once you've calculated your truth values for your first connective, you move on, in this case, to your second or main connective, and you calculate according to the truth definitions, in this case, for negation. When you're done and you want to assess the sentence, in other words, you want to determine how to classify the sentence, you can go up to the assessment button. And because you're dealing just with a single sentence, not with multiple sentences, you are going to assess the sentence in terms of this uppermost field. You are going to determine whether or not the sentence is a tautology, that is, whether or not the sentence is true in every row or on every row in the column under the main connective. It is not a tautology. And you're also going to determine whether this sentence is truth table possible, and in fact it is. But let's pretend it isn't. Let's click it is not, and then we'll click OK. So notice what has shown up. You've given 2 assessments for the sentence. Now let's look at the button that will help us determine whether or not we have not only calculated correctly, but also whether or not we have made the proper assessments. Okay, so the green check mark means that we have calculated correctly each of the rows of the truth table under the sub and main connectives. But notice that we have a red X, and this means that we've messed up somewhere on our assessment. So we'll click the assessment box and notice that we are not correct in our assessment about truth table possibility. We are correct, however, in terms of assessing the sentence as not being a tautology. So we can reassess and double check, and we have been told we're correct. Now suppose that we want to determine whether or not 2 sentences are equivalent and whether or not one of the sentences of the 2 sentences follows truth functionally from the other. We can do that by the following. We can either add a column after the sentence that we currently have by using the Command or Control A key. Alternatively, we can go up to the drop-down menu and click or select Add Column After. So let's make this sentence the following. Negation P, disjunction, negation Q. Notice I'm using the buttons for our connectives, but if you go to the user's manual, either the hard copy or electronic version, you will find some keyboard keystrokes that are shortcuts for using the buttons. Okay, once we've got our sentence, which is well formed, we can tell that because the number 2 here is in green. And notice this is sentence number 1, this is sentence number 2. You can make pretty much as many sentences as there is room for. And now, assuming that we understand how to build the truth table values, we go ahead, and in this case we'll just go left to right. We click under the column, or click in the column under one of our connectives, in this case the subconnective negation, and notice that the P is highlighted, the values under P rather are highlighted, and so we have the following: false, false, true, true. Or we move to the column under the negation for negation Q. Here again we have our referent, and we get false, true, false, true. And then lastly, the main connective is the disjunction, and when we click in the column under this main connective, we get our reference. So using Boole is great. It's in some ways more helpful than pencil and paper because the program gives you a hand. It gives you some hints as to how you're supposed to proceed. We know the truth definitions for disjunction, and we fill in the table accordingly. False, true, true, true. Now, if we want to assess these two sentences, what we're going to do is focus on the main connective, that is the column under the negation on the first sentence, and the disjunction, the column under the disjunction in the second sentence. We click the window, the assessment window, and notice the second and third fields are available to us. The top one isn't, and that's because we have more than one sentence in our truth table. We can say that the sentences are or are not tautologically equivalent. Recall that sentences are tautologically equivalent when the truth values on every row of the truth table under the main connective of each sentence are the same. In this case, the sentences are tautologically equivalent. Notice we can make a further assessment about truth functional consequence or tautological consequence. In other words, we can determine whether or not sentence 2 is or is not a tautological consequence of sentence 1 and vice versa. Since the values are truth functionally equivalent, we know that each sentence is a tautological consequence of the other one. What we mean by that is this: there is no row in each of the sentences, if you look at the column under the main operator, where the first sentence has a truth value of true while the second sentence has a truth value of false. When you're done with your work, you're going to want to save it. In fact, you should probably save it as you go along, but at any point that you decide to save your work, you should save as instructed by the given exercise or exercise set in the textbook. So you will either go under the File menu and click on Save As, or if you haven't saved the document yet, just use Control or Command S, and then make sure that you save your work in a place that is well organized. Remember, most of the time that you save your work, you're saving it so that you can submit it to GradeGrinder.